Bruce in London.
A bumper turnout. Americans queue for hours to deliver their verdict on the presidency. George Bush and John Kerry keep on campaigning throughout Election Day in the hunt for every last vote. Across America, polling stations report very high attendance, and Kerry supporters claim this could help them.
Tonight's other headlines. Another Labour rebellion. This time MPs defy the government over smacking. Firearms officers down weapons in protest of the suspension of their colleagues. And a costly own goal sees Arsenal stumble in Europe.
And in the northwest, so cramped it was like bunks in a submarine. The Chinese restaurateurs who packed illegal immigrants into rooms. And the Vulcan bomber that's going for sky-high prices on an internet auction site.
A very good evening from Washington. America's voters have turned out in remarkably large numbers to deliver their verdict on who should occupy the White House for the next 4 years. Polling stations will begin to close in around 2 hours' time. The candidates, George W. Bush and John Kerry, have both broken with tradition and continued campaigning on Election Day itself, a sure sign that this has become a fight for every last vote. Tonight, President Bush has returned here to Washington to watch the results coming in, while John Kerry is in his home city of Boston. In a moment, we'll be hearing from Gavin Hewitt, who's traveling with the Kerry camp. But first, here's Matt Fry with the Bush team on the day America's polling stations were crowded with voters.
Morning in America, the moon on the way down, the sun on the way up. If only this election were that predictable. The reason it isn't is because of them. Voters lining up from coast to coast in unprecedented numbers to exercise their democratic right. Split down the middle, defying the pollsters, infuriating the pundits, and unsettling the candidates. So, after 9/11, 2 wars and a string of political gambles that no one had expected, the president is voting near his Texas ranch in an election that is above all a referendum on him.
Feel great, thank you. Let me go vote first.
While the Bushes cast their ballots, Karl Rove, the president's political mastermind, is confident enough to joke with the press.
Republican areas are turning out in huge numbers all across the country.
They better hope they are. Mr. Bush's turn, a man who says what he thinks and looks how he feels, apprehensive.
It would be nothing better for our system, for the election to be conclusively over tonight, so that I think it's going to be me, so I can go on and lead this country.
Watch the First Lady stroke her husband's hand in reassurance, touching and perhaps telling.
Thank you, sir.
To Washington on Air Force One, but not before stopping off in Ohio to rally the Republican ground troops and reach out to voters one very last time.
I promise you it's me.
Early afternoon, back to a place he still hopes to call home by this time tomorrow. George W. Bush, love him or hate him, the conviction politician always underestimated, the gambler who bet the bank on Iraq, on tax cuts, on so much else. The question remains, do enough Americans see it his way? We're about to find out. Matt Fry, BBC News, with the Bush campaign back at the White House.
The first early hours of polling day. John Kerry in Wisconsin. A quick glance at his watch. Even he was a little surprised there were still crowds to work.
It's 20 to 2 in the morning, and this is the last campaign stop. A hangar in a small little town called La Crosse by the Mississippi.
After the handshakes, he sat in his car. All his life he had dreamed of becoming president. Now his 2-year quest was almost over. After a few hours' sleep, he visited campaign workers. He knows everything depends on efforts like this, the largest operation in American history to get out the vote.
Wonderful. Can we count on your vote?
By the end of the day, the Democrats say they will have made 25 million calls. Then, finally, John Kerry and his wife, Teresa, flew back to Boston. and the candidate patted the tarmac of his home city. He went immediately to the State House to vote. On the way, he told staff he had done all he could. After he had voted, he spoke about the beauty of the country he had travelled and the importance of voting.
This campaign has been an amazing journey, a wonderful journey. The American people have opened their homes, their hearts to us, all of us. They've brought us in, shared their struggles, and now the campaign comes to an end and the American people are going to decide.
This evening he will retreat here inside his house on Beacon Hill with some crewmates from his days in Vietnam, as well as his family and closest aides, to wait for the nation's verdict. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, with the Kerry campaign in Boston.
So as polling draws to a close here on the East Coast, let's talk to our correspondents with the Bush and Kerry campaigns. Gavin Hewitt with the Democrats in Boston, and Matt Fry, of course, who's at the Reagan Center tonight in Washington. Matt, I'll start with you. What are the vibes tonight from the Republican campaign?
Well, I keep coming across Republicans who say, how are we doing? As if I knew. I think what we can say with certainty is that both tribes, the Republicans and the Democrats, have got all the faithful they can possibly get out to vote to the polling booths. So this election might actually hinge on that tiny little sliver of undecided Americans. Now, historically, the undecided tend to side with the challenger, with John Kerry. But remember, Hugh, history has been overturned so many times before in this campaign, it might be overturned again tonight.
And to you, Gavin, in Boston, what are they telling you there in the Democrat camp?
Well, there are quite a lot of smiles on faces here. They say the day so far is going according to their plan. They do have that large turnout in Florida, which they were looking for. They say many of the first-time voters, the 18 to 24-year-olds, they've turned out, as well as the newly registered voters. And their game plan has always been, if you can get those people out, then they're quite confident. But seeing John Kerry today, yes, quietly confident, but I felt also sanguine. And certainly when he and his friends gather in their house on Beacon Hill, not far from here, in a couple of hours' time, there will be a lot of anxiety, a lot of biting of nails, and they're certainly not taking this for granted. But I do get the impression they have got today, certainly, what they were looking for in terms of turnout. Hugh.
All right, Gavin, thank you very much. And Matt, thank you too. Well, the result of this election, when it comes, won't just be a matter of counting the popular vote. Each state is allocated a number of votes in what's called the Electoral College. And the victorious candidate is the one who wins a majority of those votes. And that's the process which leads eventually to the swearing in of the new president on Capitol Hill in January, as Peter Snow now explains.
It looks like being breathtakingly close tonight, perhaps even closer than it was 4 years ago when George Bush swept across, colouring red for Republican, 30 of the states from the northwest down to the south there, and the Democrats coloured blue for the Democrats, three main areas, the northeast around New York, the centre around Chicago, and the western coast here. Now, what matters in an American election is not just winning a lot of states. The key thing in America is to win the states that bring the prizes that go to win that election. And the prizes are the so-called electoral votes. 270 electoral votes will win either of these candidates the election. So, what Bush and Kerry are after is the electoral votes, and let me tell you how it works. Here's Wyoming, for example, a tiny state in terms of population, only 500,000 people, and it delivers just 3 electoral votes. Compare that with California, 35 million people in California, and it delivers no fewer than 55 electoral votes. And what happens in each state is that the winner of the popular vote, on the whole, takes all its electoral votes. So what are the targets then that Bush and Kerry have to win if they're to win that 270? Here we have them, and no secret about some of them, because that's where they've been campaigning from the beginning of this campaign right to the end. Ohio is number 1, 20 electoral votes. Red last time for Democrat, Kerry wants to turn it blue. The second one, absolutely critical. Fairly early on tonight, we'll get the call for Florida, what we think may be the projected result. 27 electoral votes in Florida. 47 there then, waiting for John Kerry to have a go at. George Bush is also on the warpath. Pennsylvania, 21 electoral votes there. Again, they've been campaigning vigorously in Pennsylvania. And another target for George Bush, the 10 electoral votes slap in the middle of Democrat territory. In Wisconsin, that will give him 31 electoral votes. It may go so close to the wire, this election, that we may even find round about 4 o'clock in the morning that we're looking at tiny little Hawaii, which, by the way, we've hauled in from the Pacific so that we can show it to you. 4 electoral votes there, normally safe Democratic country. It could be decided there. The polls say it's very close in Hawaii.
Peter Snow there. And by the way, you can find more details on the American election using a special news service that we're launching tonight. 10 o'clock News Extra, the world's first interactive news bulletin, is available to all digital viewers by pressing the red button on the remote control. Every night we'll provide background information and extra detail on the day's main stories, and tonight we'll be going behind the scenes at a campaign rally. Right, we'll be back here in Washington later in the programme. Now it's time to join you, Fiona, back in London.
Thank you. Here, Labour suffered its second backbench rebellion in as many nights, but the 49 rebels failed in their bid for an outright ban on smacking. Instead, the Commons backed plans to allow mild smacking in England and Wales, but to ban anything which causes visible bruising or reddening of the skin.
No bad behaviour at tea tonight, but the Bleakleys won't end up behind bars for acting on their belief that just occasionally smacking a naughty child can have its place. But the government is going to tighten the law. Many MPs wanted to send a stronger message that all smacking is wrong. This family just doesn't think they should interfere.
Oh, well, this is just the epitome of the nanny state, isn't it? I mean, the term was made for such things, interfering in individual family situations in a very heavy-handed and an unnecessary way.
Exactly why ministers were vehemently opposed to an outright ban.
Nobody lightly smacks a child. Most people feel bad, feel ridden with guilt, feel they have failed if they resort to smacking. But do honourable members really believe we can support good parenting by adding to those bad feelings by threatening the strong arm of the law?
The cries of yes showed some did want precisely that.
Children tell it as it is. Smacking is hitting, and smacking hurts. It causes not only physical pain, it hurts inside too. So yes, this amendment would criminalise hitting to exactly the same extent as hitting adults is criminalised.
The ayes to the right, 75. The noes to the left, 424.
The total ban was defeated, but the government is getting rid of the defence of reasonable chastisement and backing a change to the law, banning smacking if it causes actual bodily harm, such as reddening of the skin, bruising or mental harm. Both those who want a complete ban and those against any change think this will lead to a muddle. 49 Labour MPs defied the government tonight. That's more than voted against the gambling bill yesterday. The trouble with rebellion is it may be a bit like smacking. At first it's done in exasperation, but very soon it becomes a habit. Mark Mardell, BBC News, Westminster.
More than 100 firearms officers in London are refusing to carry guns in protest at the suspension of 2 of their colleagues. The officers were suspended after an inquest last week into the fatal shooting of a man they mistakenly believed was carrying a gun 5 years ago. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir John Stevens, has taken personal control of negotiations in the dispute. Margaret Gilmore is at Scotland Yard. Margaret.
Fiona, Sir John told me earlier the situation is extremely serious. There are still firearms officers on duty, but more than a quarter have now downed their weapons. Now, he and his team of officers have been working late tonight to try and prevent the problem escalating. These are the officers in training who deal with the most dangerous armed criminals. As increasing numbers refuse to carry weapons, most pre-planned armed operations in London have been cancelled. This after the shooting of Harry Stanley. The 2 officers who mistakenly thought the chair leg he was carrying was a gun have been suspended and face possible prosecution. Their colleagues are dismayed.
They're saying, look, this is not fair. We can't go out there and do what we're expected to do and try and protect the public, make split-second decisions if the tactics that we've been trained to use may be suspect. That's simply not on.
The officers are part of a 400-strong squad known as SO19, based here in East London. More than a quarter have now downed their weapons. The head of the Metropolitan Police visited to take control of negotiations and spoke to more than 100 of them. Afterwards, he said he'd ordered a review of the 2 suspensions.
There's a lot of anger around that they feel they're doing a job, they're putting their lives on the line, it's a highly specialized job, and yet at the end of the day, do they have the protection of the law? And this is something which they're really concerned about. This has taken 5 years to come about. It's not good enough for the families of the people who've died, and it's not good enough for the officers. There must be a better way of doing this, and we need to address that now.
SO19 provides armed backup to unarmed police, as here in a siege last year. Those involved in today's dispute say they're not prepared to use weapons if it means they're putting their livelihoods at risk. If this isn't resolved fast, the police will find it increasingly difficult to recruit firearms officers. Well, many, including the dead man's family, believe the two officers should accept their suspension. But Sir John's priority is to get their colleagues back to work. He's asked the Home Secretary tonight for new laws to speed cases like this. But I think his personal intervention will have made a huge difference. He's a former firearms officer himself. And I think there is a chance we'll see a deal, a resolving of all of this in the next couple of days.
Thanks, Margaret. The Arabic TV channel Al Jazeera is reporting that it has received a new video of the aid worker Margaret Hassan held hostage in Iraq. In it, she appears distressed, and her kidnappers threatened to turn her over to the militant group led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, believed to be responsible for the murder of Ken Bigley. Today, the Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern met Irish members of Mrs. Hassan's family in Dublin. They made a further appeal for her release. A Dutch film director who made a controversial film about violence against women in Muslim communities has been murdered in Amsterdam. Theo van Gogh had received death threats after his film was broadcast earlier this year. Stephen Sacker reports.
At 9 a.m., Theo van Gogh was stabbed on this Amsterdam street. According to witnesses, the attacker shot the stricken filmmaker half a dozen times to make sure he was dead. A letter was left on the body. Police arrested a man said to be of dual Dutch-Moroccan nationality after a shootout nearby. Theo van Gogh was a celebrated and controversial figure in the Netherlands. Last summer, he outraged many in the Muslim community with his film Submission.
Oh Allah, as I lie here wounded.
In it, a veiled Muslim woman speaks of terrible abuse suffered at the hands of her husband and family. At times, much of her naked body is visible, with verses from the Quran scrawled on it. The film led to death threats. Today, the Dutch Prime Minister gave this response.
We cannot allow bullets to rule our society, because then dialogue is impossible and our differences are irreconcilable.
Inevitably today, memories have been revived of Pim Fortuyn, the maverick right-wing Dutch politician who was murdered 2 years ago. Ironically, Theo van Gogh had just finished a film about the significance of Fortuyn's assassination. Tonight, thousands of people gathered in Amsterdam to express their anger and despair. For the Netherlands, it means another round of soul-searching. Stephen Sacker, BBC News, Brussels.
The Queen and Prince Philip are in Germany for a 3-day state visit. After laying a wreath in honour of the victims of the Second World War in Berlin, the Queen acknowledged the suffering of both sides in the war and praised the efforts to build a lasting peace. June Kelly reports.
This is the Queen's first state visit to Germany for 12 years. Over the past decade, the Anglo-German relationship has strengthened. As well as the present, this trip also has to focus on the past. In this month of remembrance, the Queen went to the Cenotaph in Berlin to pay her respects to Germany's war dead. Here, a statue of a mother clutching her dying son. At the Cenotaph are the tombs of an unknown soldier and an unknown concentration camp victim. Tonight, at a state banquet, came the Queen's first speech of the visit. Here she acknowledged Britain and Germany's parallel sense of loss.
And in remembering the appalling suffering of war on both sides, we recognise how precious is the peace we have built in Europe since 1945. It is difficult for someone of my generation to overemphasise this.
Looking to the future, she highlighted an issue currently the subject of a big conference in Berlin.
At a global level, one new and urgent challenge we face together is climate change. Tomorrow, I shall be present at the opening of the German-British conference on this subject at the British Embassy.
With the 60th anniversary of the end of the Second World War next year, officials hope this visit will foster a spirit of reconciliation. Tomorrow, the Queen will host a concert in aid of the restoration of a church in Dresden, which was destroyed by Allied bombers. June Kelly, BBC News, Berlin.
Football, and Arsenal faltered again in Europe tonight as they were held to a draw at home by the Greek side Panathinaikos. They've now drawn 3 of their 4 Champions League games this season. Kevin Geary reports.
Still undefeated in Europe, yet still so unconvincing. Arsene Wenger is not alone in being mystified why his Arsenal side can't reproduce their domestic panache in the Champions League. And tonight they even needed a generously awarded penalty to take the lead against unfancied Panathinaikos. The referee was right to give it, but it was the sort of award away teams seldom get.
It's Henry!
Although Thierry Henry dispatched it in forthright manner, it was to be about the only straightforward task they got right all night. Midway through the second half, they too conceded a penalty as Papadopoulos was felled by Ashley Cole. The relief of the Highbury faithful was palpable as Bassinas wastefully gave it the Johnny Wilkinson treatment. Soon after, growing Greek hopes were justly rewarded when Vintra's shot flew in off Seagull, to leave Arsenal with genuine worries about progressing further. Kevin Geary, BBC News.
It was a better night for Chelsea. They qualified for the knockout stages of the Champions League with a 1-0 win in Moscow against CSKA. Arjen Robben finished off a neat series of passes to score the only goal of the encounter in the first half. Chelsea topped Group H with maximum points from their 4 games. And a solitary goal was enough for Celtic as well, as they recorded their first win in Group F. Alan Thompson found the net in the first half to secure victory against Shakhtar Donetsk. The Celtic remain bottom of their group. Now with just hours to go before polling closes in America, let's return to Washington and Hugh.
Fiona, thanks very much. Well, everyone agrees that this campaign has been the most divisive, the most bruising of recent times. The candidates themselves rely on a small group of close family and friends to sustain them over many months. Bush and Kerry, by the way, were both students at Yale in the 1960s, and that was where some of the strongest friendships were formed. I tracked down a couple of friends whose advice is still being sought and heeded. We came to the city of Chicago on the shores of Lake Michigan to meet 2 men who've known the presidential candidates for the best part of 40 years. Donald Etra made his name as an extremely successful defense lawyer, and he's no less effective when it comes to defending his old college friend, George W. Bush.
He's maintained the same friendships for his entire life. The people that he was friendly in college, he's still friendly with now. Invites us to the White House, is gracious to us, is hospitable to us, and welcomes our opinions even though we might not agree with him on everything.
Some people say, of course, that he's not a very bright guy. What do you say to that?
They're wrong. He's a brilliant guy. He's a terrific people person. He reads people extremely well. He might not be brilliant in the sense of bookish or the traditional intellectual, but he reads everything, he understands everything, he assimilates everything, and then makes his own decisions.
Don Etra has been a frequent visitor to the White House. This photo was taken after the president appointed him to the board of the Holocaust Memorial Museum. The Etra family has spent nights at the White House too. It's a bond of friendship that's lasted since the 1960s.
This is the book that was given to the freshmen in 1964, so obviously there's a picture of President Bush as he looked in 1963, and yours truly, who hasn't aged a bit.
What is remarkable about this election, of course, is that we have 2 candidates here, both of whom were at Yale in the late 60s. What are your thoughts on that?
I think even in those days, George Bush felt more comfortable with himself and was a friendlier, more outgoing person as opposed to somebody who was focused on one goal, namely being President of the United States.
The incredible energy he puts into everything he does. John is not someone...
Not surprisingly, John Kerry's friends have a rather different story to tell. Back in the 60s, Harvey Bundy shared a room with Kerry at Yale. Today, Mr. Bundy is a wealthy Chicago businessman who's throwing all his weight behind the Kerry campaign.
He was focused. John was not someone to have a lot of idle time on his mind. And so if John wanted to do something, you probably ended up doing what John wanted to do, even if you'd been thinking that maybe something else was a good idea.
What is it about John Kerry's character and temperament that in your view makes him so suitable to be president?
I think John's willingness to listen and John's willingness to balance the different sides before he takes action, and then when he takes action, taking decisive action.
Above all, those who believe in John Kerry's bid for the presidency say that this is the time for a new start, both at home and beyond America's shores.
John has a relationship, a nature, and an experience in terms of the foreign policy issue. John will reach out to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is waiting for someone in the United States to do that, and Bush can't do it.
Harvey Bundy there, one of John Kerry's closest friends, talking to me at his home in Chicago. Now you can see all the election results as they come in on a special election program starting at about 10 to midnight here on BBC One. Fiona will be back in a few minutes with a recap on the day's headlines, but now it's time to join our news teams across the UK.
Good evening, I'm Annabelle Tiffin. 3 directors of a high-profile Chinese restaurant in Liverpool have pleaded guilty to providing homes and jobs to illegal immigrants. When police raided a house owned by 2 of them, it was said to be so cramped it looked like the accommodation for sailors in a submarine. Andy Gill reports.
Going into court to plead guilty to breaking immigration laws, Shum Kun Mu trying to hide his face and his wife Shum Tan Ling in the red jacket. Ip Hoing Chung in the blue jacket also admitted providing accommodation and employment to 11 illegal Chinese workers. Mr. Ip also admitted deceiving immigration officials by falsely claiming he had money to invest in a business. That business was the Chung Ku restaurant in Liverpool. The 3 defendants admitted employing 11 illegal immigrants here, all men aged between 20 and 30. Mr. and Mrs. Shum, who live in St. Helens, started the restaurant from scratch and had Mr. Ip as a 3rd director. In February last year, police raided 3 houses in Northumberland Street in Liverpool, owned by the Shums. They found 15 people, including Mr. Ip. The prosecution say this was the staff house of the Chung Ku restaurant, where illegal immigrants lived when not working. One police officer said it was so cramped it looked like sailors' bunks on a submarine. The workers were paid in cash. Some had bought mobile phones and won a car. The prosecution say illegal immigrants are cheaper to employ as they can be paid less and there's no tax or national insurance. Mr. and Mrs. Shum took the bulk of the profits from the business, twice as much as Mr. Ip. All 3 will be sentenced at Liverpool Crown Court tomorrow.
The families of teenagers who killed themselves while held in custody today accused the Home Office of a cover-up for failing to investigate their children's deaths. Adam Rickwood from Burnley died while he was in custody. Campaigners say that at just 14, he shouldn't have been there in the first place. His suicide and that of 16-year-old Joseph Scholes from Sale 2 years ago had prompted calls for a public inquiry. The family of a soldier from Liverpool found shot dead in Iraq have described her as a fun-loving girl who was the life and soul of the party. The body of 34-year-old Staff Sergeant Denise Rose was found at a military camp in Basra. The Ministry of Defence says her death's not thought to have been the result of hostile action. Barrow's shipyard workers have voted 2-1 for a 6-month trial, swapping their fixed tea breaks for £1,000. The staff at BAE Systems are also in line for a pay rise of nearly 12% over the next 2 years, if they can bump up productivity by an extra 5%. Plans have been put together to drastically improve Stockport town centre. The changes would cost £500 million and concentrate on making more of the River Mersey. Our reporter Jane Barrett has been looking at the master plan.
It's a fairly average town, but like a lot of other towns, it has a master plan to make it better. The master plan will turn the 60s precincts into modern spaces. It will bring the Mersey back up from beneath the pavements, create waterside parks where people will want to live and play. It will make this town almost double in size. At least it will, if the master plan attracts the cash.
A master plan enables you to really show what the long-term future is, interest developers and investors.
And they seem to be interested in Stockport. Its master plan looks to the future while building on its unique heritage, like the market, like the viaduct, like the Mersey.
We don't see any future in trying to recreate a mini-me version of Manchester, for example. Stockport has its own strengths and attributes and we want to build on them.
So, is there a future for our slightly tired, often 60s feeling town centres? Well, here at the GMEX, it seems there is. Once a year, this conference centre is taken over by the really big retailers and the really big shopping centres. They're here to do business, and this year especially, they want to do business in the smaller towns.
Consumers want to see the same shops in their town, but actually what they want to see is the same shops, but they want to see a different environment.
Small can be beautiful when it comes to town centre shopping.
A 40-ton Vulcan bomber has gone on sale on an internet auction site. Its starting price was £6,000, but throughout the day bids have risen and have now reached £7 million. But are the bids genuine? Dave Guest has been following the story.
Well, it's been a feature of the landscape here at Blackpool Airport for more than 20 years. 40 tons of aviation history. But times change and Blackpool Airport's expanding, so they need this site for other things. That means the Vulcan has to go. The problem is, where do you sell something like that? Well, the owner thought he'd try eBay, the internet auction site. It started with a reserve price of £6,000 and soon got it. But the bids kept on coming and coming.
Hard to believe, really, isn't it?
Do you believe it?
Well, we've got our doubts.
So what are you going to do?
Well, we'll not do anything for the moment, and the next 24 hours will tell.
Bidding will close on Saturday. Then Brian will have to sift through the bids to find out exactly who has the money to back up their aspirations. Realistically, what do you think this plane will go for?
Well, I'm not going to say that, because the more we get, the better.
The Vulcans were once formidable fighting machines. They last saw active service for Britain in the Falklands War. But when or if they find a buyer, there is one thing that person will have to take into account. How do you move a thing like this?
Indeed. 2 football results tonight. Lee McCulloch struck a late winner as Wigan maintained their 6-point advantage at the top of the Coca-Cola Championship with a 1-0 win over Stoke, and Crewe were held to a 2-2 draw with Leicester. A look at the weather now. Tonight cloudy and misty with some showers, lows of about 8. Tomorrow a cloudy morning with some showers, but it should dry up by the afternoon with temperatures reaching about 13. And the outlook for Thursday, mostly dry with some sunshine. And that's all from me. Now it's back to Fiona Bruce in London. Good night.
And the main news tonight, America's voters have turned out in large numbers to vote on who should occupy the White House for the next 4 years. The candidates, George W. Bush and John Kerry, have both broken with tradition and continued campaigning on Election Day itself. There have been long queues outside some polling stations since early morning, with predictions of a very high turnout. A reminder that if you're a digital viewer, you can get more information on the US election from 10 o'clock News Extra by pressing your red button. But from all of us on the 10 o'clock team, good night.
Hello there. We're in for brighter skies across the UK over the next few days compared to the last couple. More our weather in just a moment, because all eyes are, of course, firmly focused on the United States. Many places here having a fine, dry, bright election day, but you'll notice this streak of cloud, which has been providing some pretty heavy rain all the way up from Texas to Ohio. Elsewhere, though, it should stay fine, I think, for what's left of election day. For our day, well, it was pretty gloomy, but the Moray Firth, again, the place to be for sunshine. Kinloss for the second day running, the sunniest spot across the UK. Caithness and Sutherland also poking out away from the cloud, but elsewhere it was a pretty grey, gloomy and dank day, and still an awful lot of cloud around at the moment. Outbreaks of rain here and there, particularly for northwest England, North Wales, eastern parts of Northern Ireland, southern and eastern Scotland overnight. Elsewhere, turning a bit drier, but where we do see any cloud breaks, we'll have some fog forming. So either through fog or cloud, I think it'll be a fairly grey start to Wednesday morning. Still some rain around here and there, particularly across northern England, North Wales, and southern Scotland. Gradually, though, I think as the morning goes on, that rain tending to peter out. The fog will lift, the cloud will lift, and most of us will turn much brighter through the course of the afternoon. Not hugely sunny, still a lot of cloud around. Some places, though, seeing a little bit of blue sky here and there. Now, the rain will return to the west